Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Foremost, I praise to Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala for the blessing and grace given to me while I'm working on my study so that I finally can finish this study well. The salawat and greetings are poured out to the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, who has always guided us to the right path. The Honorable Professor Dr. Abdurrahman Faridi, MPD, as the first examiner, and the Honorable Dr. Hendi Pratama, SPD MA, as the second examiner. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Safira Rizky Amanda GP, English Education Students 2016 in English Department, Faculty of Languages and Arts of Universitas Negeri Semarang. This video is made for the requirements of my final project defense for my Sarjana Pendidikan degree in English Education. My final project is under the title Enhancing Student Speaking Skill Through Podcasts, a quasi-experimental research of students' conversation at SMA Negeri 1 Comal, and supervised by Mr. Arif Suryo Priyatmojo, SPD MPD. There are 6 contents that we'll discuss in this presentation. The first content is Introduction. There is background of the study which consists of 4 main points. In various countries such as Indonesia, China, and Hong Kong, most students may have trouble to speak English well. Based on CMA 2006, page 30, speaking itself represents an interactive process involving the production and receiving process to serve both interactional and transactional conversation. Meanwhile, Brown, 2001, page 232, reveals that there are 4 language skills that have to be mastered by students: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Speaking is one of the basic abilities that exist in our daily life to be mastered. In addition, improving the speaking skills in English is one of the things that is indispensable in various fields in this highly advanced era. On the other hand, the language skills of the students can increase the competitiveness of their nation in a global society. The English language teaching and learning process are also brought to the students to learn the relationship between cultures through language. To reach the goal, the students, especially students of senior high school, have to master the 4 skills of English as mentioned above. Even so, it is not easy to teach the students to reach the primary goal. Technology is one of the media to help the non-native speakers improve their speaking skill. Technology is a central part in our everyday lives now. Marshall, 2002, page 18, states that new opportunities can be gained through technology. The technology offers users to connect each other around the world and gives a lot of distinctive perspective and experiences. That's why the researcher chose podcasts as one of those that provide an interesting content for language learning. Podcast is like a modern radio. It can be a video or audio which is uploaded to the website and several platforms like Spotify and YouTube, where the people can download the podcast through the internet freely. Podcast itself can be listened on some mobile devices that support MP3 and MP4 files, such as on a computer, smartphone, and also MP3 player. By reason of that, podcast gives a chance to teachers to support the students improve their speaking skill. After identifying the problem, the researcher wanted to formulate the discussion of the study by presenting these problems. First, how can the use of podcasts improve student speaking skill at 10th grade students of SMA Negeri 1 Comal? Second, does podcast improve students' speaking skill at 10th grade student of SMA Negeri 1 Comal? The researcher stated the objectives of the study as follow. First, to find out how the podcast improve effective the student speaking skill at the 10th grade of SMA Negeri 1 Comal. And then to find out whether podcasts improve the student speaking skill at 10th grade students of SMA Negeri 1 Comal. Therefore, there are two significances. First, theoretical significance. Hopefully, podcasts can be a positive way to improve the student's speaking skill. The researcher assumes that using podcasts in learning English is an innovative media to improve the student's speaking skill. And then, practical significance. First, to the English teachers. This research can give an additional knowledge and experience on how to improve the student's speaking skill. And then for the students, the study will be effective to enhance their speaking skill. Next, to other researchers, the result of this research study can be one of the references for conducting other research related to this research study. And then for English Language Education Department, the result of this research study can encourage other students of the English language education to conduct similar research. Move on the next content, that is review of related study. In conducting this study, the researcher took 5 previous studies that have similarities with this research. Based on the 5 previous studies, the writer found the similarities and differences in this research study. The similarities between this research study and the other previous study are in the English skill that the researchers focus on and also the target of the study, which is to improve the student's speaking skill through podcast. Besides, the differences between this research study and the other is on the media that carried out in the research study in order to improve the student's speaking skill. Otherwise, there is theoretical review which supported this study. This part, which consisted of independent and dependent variables. Independent variable related to podcasts, foreign language learning, and teaching media, while dependent variable is about speaking skill. Therefore, one of the purposes of language teaching is to help students develop communication skills. Teacher has to be facilitator who can support and develop the speaking ability of the students. Podcast is one of the innovative learning media. The students are invited to be active by sharing their ideas about the podcast video. They will also be easier get and share the ideas creatively. The use of podcast is intended to enhance students' speaking skill, and this statement is the theoretical framework of this study. The following part is about methodology of this final project. As the research design, the researcher used Quasi experimental design because it is a suitable design for the final project to observe and get the cause and effect relation of this research by comparing one or more control group who get particular or common treatment with one or more experimental groups who get a different treatment. Well, the researcher used pretest and posttest as the instruments of the study, and the population in this research was the 10th grade students of SMA Negeri 1 Comal, Pemalang, in the academic year of 2019 to 2020. In addition, as a sample, the researcher decided that the 10 MIPA 2 was an experimental group while the 10 MIPA 3 was a control group. A conversation part in the textbook was applied for control class, while podcast was applied for experimental class. Both of them were given the pretest and posttest. Cook and Wang, 2008, argues that the design of experiment research can be seen as follows. While O1 is stood for pretest of experimental group, O2 is posttest for experimental group, O3 is pretest for control group, O4 is posttest for control group, X1 is the treatment for experimental group, and X2 is the treatment for control group. To analyze the data, The researcher used a formula based on Macmillan and Schumacher 2001, which is consisted of mean, median, mode, standard deviation, and categorization. The formulas are as follows. Mean, where sigma fx is the sum of the students. And then search for data distribution, where sigma f1 is frequency of student score, x midpoint of student score, and n is the sum of students. The next is mode, where L is the lower limit of the interval, E is interval, F1 is the first frequency, and F2 is the second frequency that of the following interval. The next is median, where L is stood for the lower limit of the interval, I is interval, CFB is the cumulative frequency in all interval, and N is the sum of group. And there is FW is the frequency of cases within the interval containing the median. And the next part is standard deviation, where sigma f1 is frequency of the students, x1 is student score, and n is sum of the students. And the next is categorization. To calculate the ideal average, or MI, used the formula as follows. MI equal half of the highest ideals plus the lowest ideals. The other hand, normality test was used to test the sample from the population that will be analyzed whether both groups have normal distribution or not. To calculate the normality test, the researcher used Kolmogorov-Smirnov formula. The interpretation of the normality test can be concluded as follows. If the sig two-tailed bigger than 0.05, it can be concluded that the data is normally distributed. But if the sig two-tailed smaller than 0.05, it can be concluded that the population in distribution is not normal. And next is data homogeneity. Homogeneity test was used to know whether two groups, experimental and control class, have homogeneity or not. The interpretation can be concluded as follows. If the significance is less than 0.05, the variance differs significantly or not homogeneous. But if the sig two-tailed bigger than 0.05, the variance is significantly similar or it can be said homogeneous. Therefore, there is hypothesis testing. To analyze the data of pretest and data of post-test scores, the researcher applied regression analysis test. This test aims to determine whether a free variable or an independent variable affects again a bound variable or a dependent variable. In this study, the researcher conducted this regression analysis test to know whether podcasts as independent variable affected again a student score as dependent variable. The interpretation of the result can be concluded as follows. If the sig two-tailed is smaller than 0.05, the hypothesis is accepted. But if the sig bigger than 0.05, the hypothesis is rejected. Otherwise, the researcher have two roles in conducting this research. The first one as the data collector, and the second one is as the data analyzer or data analysis. And in collecting the data, The researcher followed the following steps as the procedure. The first one is determining the subject. There were two classes at 10 grades of SMA Negeri 1 Comal, which consisted of 36 students for each class. The sample of experimental class was 10 MIPA 2 and the sample of control class was 10 MIPA 3. And then selecting the materials. The researcher chose the materials from the student's book based on the syllabus for the control group and podcast video from YouTube about the positive habits for the experimental group. And then the researcher conducted tryout tests to another subject of sample used in this research. The purpose of conducting tryout tests is to achieve validity and reliability of the instruments. Tryout sample was the students in different class, namely 10 MIPA 1, with the total population was 36 students. After that, the researcher conducting the pretest, treatments, and also the post-test. The treatments is conducted, were held in 4 meetings. And finally, after conducting the final test, the researcher analyzed the data. In addition, to find out the validity and reliability, the researcher used SPSS. In the study, the instrument used is speaking test to measure whether the test in this research had a good quality. The types of validity were used in this research were content validity and also construct validity. Therefore, iterator reliability was applied in this research in order to ensure the reliability of the score and to avoid the subjectivity of the researcher. An upcoming part is findings and discussion. Pretest. After conducting the tryout test on 2nd March 2020, the researcher conducted pretest to experimental class on 3rd March 2020 and it was started at 7 a.m. Before administering pretest, the researcher explained the topic about complement and podcast. Then the researcher showed the podcast video. After that, the researcher asked the students to make conversation text about the podcast. For the control group, pretest was held on 4th March 2020 and it was started at 10:15 a.m. The researcher gave the students situational dialogue about complement. After that, the researcher asked the students to make a conversation text. Both groups performed the conversation in front of the class. In performing the test, the students were asked to speak up clearly. The result of the pretest was analyzed by the researcher to know the students' prior achievement on speaking and to manage the following treatments. The first one, pretest for experimental class. By using the calculation, the mean, standard deviation, median, mode were found out, and the frequency distribution of the data pretest is as follows in Table 4, where Fi, the number of the student, and Xi is the frequency of the score, and Fixi is the calculation between the number of the student and the frequency of the score. From the data, the lowest score of the students are 53 and the highest score are 65. From the statistical data, the category of a pretest score of experimental class are divided into 4 categories, namely excellent, good, poor, and very poor. The table showed that there were 4 students, or 11.11% in a good category, and 32 students, or 88.89% in a poor category. It can be concluded that the majority of the students belong to a poor category in the pretest. And then for the control class, by using the calculation, the researcher got the mean, standard deviation, median, and the mode. Also, the frequency distribution of the data was showed in the table 8. From the data, it was showed that the lowest score of the students was 51 and the highest score was 63. And the category of a pretest score of control class is in the table 9. The table showed that there was no students classified into a very poor, a good, and an excellent category. All the students in a poor category. It can be concluded that the majority of the students belong to a poor category in the pretest. And the next is the post-test for the experimental class. The frequency distribution of the data is presented in Table 6. From the data, the lowest score of the students are 70 and the highest score are 79. And the category of a post-test score of experimental class showed that all the students of the experimental class post-test 100% in a good category. It can be concluded that there was an improvement of the scoring categorization from poor to good category. It means that the student speaking skill of the experimental class improved significantly after being treated using podcasts. The other hand, for the control class, the frequency distribution of the data pretest control class is presented in the table 10. The data showed that the lowest score of the students are 64 and the highest score are 73. And the category of a post-test score of control class is in table 11. The table showed that there were 15 students or 41.66% in a poor category and 21 students or 58.33% in a good category. The post-test itself was conducted after the treatments. Post-test was used in order to know the progress of the student's speaking ability after using podcasts. The post-test for the experimental class was held on 20 March 2020, while the control class was held on 19 March 2020. Before analyzing the data using inferential analysis, normality and homogeneity tests must be done. First, normality test. In analyzing the data from the test, SPSS was used. The data is presented in Table 12 as follows. The table above explained that the significance of the pretest experiment class is 0.189, and for the control class showed that the pretest is 0.068. From the data in the table above, both the sample of the experiment class and control class is in normal because the significance is bigger than 0.05. And next, homogeneity. The researcher used independent sample t-tests to know that the data are homogeneous. The data are presented into two tables that are table for the post-test of both classes and table for the pre-test of both classes. Based on the calculation above, the significance P for the post-test is 0.873 and the significance P for the pre-test is 0.585. The significance of the pretest and post-test showed that sig P bigger than 0.05 and it implied that the data is homogeneous. Next is hypothesis test. The hypothesis test can be done after the result of normality and homogeneity tests are fulfilled. The test is done by using t-test regression analysis. If HO rejected, T bigger than T table, it means that there are a difference. The procedure of t-test shall be as follows. T-table equal A n1 plus n2 minus k equal 36 the number of the student plus 36 the number of the students equal 72. The key of both are 2, so the result is 70 or 1.993. The result of hypothesis test also can be seen in the table coefficients. From the data above, it can be seen that the score of T was 3.782 with significant score 0.000 is smaller than 0.05. Cause T bigger than T table 3.782 bigger than 1.993 for level significance 0.00, HO is rejected. It means there is difference in speaking skill between experiment and control class. The results show that podcast is more effective than textbook to increase students' speaking ability. As the discussion, it was considered that there is difference between student speaking skill taught by textbook and those taught using podcasts. The result of the computation of the post-test result, the mean score of experimental class was 74.02, while the control class was 72.33. It can be interpreted that the mean score of the experimental class taught using podcast was higher than the mean score of the control class taught by using textbook. Besides, the frequency distribution of the control class post-test showed that there were 21 students, or 58.33% in a good category. Meanwhile, the frequency distribution of the experimental class post-test showed that all the students of the experimental class post-test in a good category, or 100%. The findings show that the student speaking skills scores taught using podcast was higher than the students taught using textbook. On the other side, the result of the hypothesis test showed that there was a significant difference effect on the student speaking skill between those who were taught by using podcasts and those who were not taught by using podcasts. It could be proven from the result of T, that is 3.782, which is higher than T-table, is 1.993. It meant that the students who were taught by podcasts have better speaking skills than those who were not taught by using podcasts. Thus, the use of podcasts is effective in enhancing the student's speaking skill. The next is conclusion and suggestion. According to the result above, the use of podcasts as a technique in enhancing student speaking skills can probably be one of the solutions to solve the students' difficulty in speaking. From that reason, podcasts can help the students to enhance their speaking skills and develop their language skills. It can be seen from the result of podcasts at the students in experimental class. Therefore, the use of podcasts in the learning process requires active participation of the teacher and the students, so that podcasts can be maximized to enhance students' speaking skills. And then the suggestion first goes for English teachers. The teachers are expected to be creative person in order to make the learning process more interesting and comfortable for the students. From that reason, the English teachers need to know the various methods such as podcast or another method to motivate the students and build their interest in learning English. And then for the students of English Language Education Department, they perhaps can develop the use of podcasts as a media in enhancing students' speaking skill. The other side, podcasts can be more effective and efficient technique to improve speaking. And then the last, for other researchers, the other researchers may follow the study in different contexts in order to find more actions to improve the student's speaking skill. In addition, this study must be used as one of the resources before the other researchers conduct an action research related to the improving students' speaking skill. Therefore, the researchers certainly realized that the research is not perfect. By reason of that, the researcher expects criticism and suggestion in writing research in the future. The following part is appendices. First is about tryout test. The researcher conducted tryout tests to another subject of sample used in this research. That is 10 MIPA 1 with the total population was 36 students. The tryout test was held on 2nd March 2020. The procedure of this tryout test same as the control and experiment group. In analyzing the data from the test, SPSS was used. The data is presented in the table 16 as follows. The table above explains that the significance of the pretest is 0.446 and the post-test experiment class is 0.557. Data is in normal distribution because the significance is bigger than 0.05. Based on the table, the mean of the post-test is higher than the pretest, that is 65.83 bigger than 59.38. It means that the result of the post-test score is better than the pretest. And the next part is validity and reliability. The result of the validity can be seen on the table 17 as follows. From the data, it was showed that the data is valid if the value of sig two-tailed smaller than 0.05. From the data, showed that the sig two-tailed for each items are 0.00 smaller than 0.05. And it can be said that the data instruments of the pretest is valid, while the validity of the post-test can be seen in the table 18 as follows. From the data, showed that the sig two-tailed for each items are 0.00, smaller than 0.05. Hence, it can be said that the data instruments of the post-test is valid. Besides, the result of the reliability of data is presented in table 19. From the data above, the value of Cronbach alpha is 0.929 bigger than 0.06. The data is reliable if the value of Cronbach alpha bigger than 0.06. Therefore, the data instruments of tryout tests are reliable. The student scores of tryout, control, and experimental class can be seen by click the word syllabus or click the student score or lesson plan and the photograph on this box. That's all the presentation of my final project. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.